Chapter 47. The Duel. The backwash of Klemper's spell tingled as it drew Reyes into itself. It was the same kind of tingling that Reyes had felt when passing through the magical barriers that enter the encampment, but it was a lot more intense. Then the tingling ended as abruptly as it had begun, and Reyes found himself in a room that looked almost identical, and yet was in many ways different to the one he had just been in mere seconds before. It was the same room, and yet it wasn't. As before, there were murals on the left and right walls of the room, and, as before, the murals on the left wall depicted images of harpies going about their daily business, hunting, feasting, flying, and so on. This time, though, the images on the right wall, instead of showing the life cycle of humans, now seemed to show more images of harpy life. There were other changes. The engravings that covered the columns supporting the ceiling of the room were also very different. Now, they too depicted only harpies. The missing column was now back in its rightful place, supporting the ceiling. There was no passage here that would lead inexorably back to the surface. The passage that Reyes and Mangloss had used to enter the twin of this room simply didn't exist here. Where the opening should have been, there was a wall covered in more murals. No harpies this time, but the images of gods. So many gods that though Reyes could recognise the name of some of them, there were others that he had no clue who they were. There were several obscure gods that maybe even the most learned of human priests didn't know existed. Without the presence of Klemper's army obscuring his range of vision, Reyes was also able to see the very far end of the room. There he saw a pair of large golden doors, evidently leading through to another room of some description. There were intricate patterns on the surface of the doors, which, although very subtle, were visible from across the room, even to the eyes of a harpy. And in front of the doors, standing on either side, were large gold statues of harpies, a male to the left and a female to the right. They faced each other across the facade of the doors. They were both kneeling, as if paying homage to whatever was lying beyond those doors. Klemper and Mangloss were standing nearby, very nearby. Reyes could reach out and touch Mangloss if he had desired, and Klemper was at most no more than 3 or 4 feet in front of the old mage. The briefest of moments had passed since Klemper had cast the spell. Reyes wasn't the only passenger to have been dragged unwillingly into the backwash of the spell. Just before Klemper began to cast the spell, 3 of his elven soldiers, clad in the armour and livery of the palace guard, had been charging across the room with an eye to killing Mangloss. The 3 of them were here now, and although they clearly looked a little disorientated, they were still making a beeline for the old mage. There was no time to consider. Klemper was a relatively easy target, but Reyes knew he had to protect his friend and mentor from the elves. Almost immediately his training kicked in. Reyes jumped in front of the 3 and with a quick flash of his blade he cut one of them down before they even had a chance to arrest their pace. The second of the 2 elves fared slightly better. He actually managed to block Reyes' sword twice. On the third attack, Reyes just knocked his opponent's sword out of the way, taking full advantage of his superior strength. Then he ran his opponent through and swiveled quickly to block the next attack from the 3rd elf. At first it seemed as if the last elf had the upper hand. His first attack might have been parried, but he was able to make a second before Reyes could attack back. Reyes dodged the second attack with little difficulty, and then brought his sword to bear against the neck of his opponent, neatly severing the elf's head from his shoulders in one flowing move. Klemper had been watching the scene, and as the last of the 3 elves fell, he began to applaud the young harpy. "Well done! I had no doubt you could do it." "You're next," Reyes said, turning sharply, adrenaline fueling his words. Klemper grinned. "I could kill you with a thought. Since you're here, though, I'm going to let you watch as I take your friend Mangloss apart. Once he is dead, then I will send you after him." "Jenny's right. You sound like a villain in a badly written play." And with that comment, Reyes raised his sword above his head and started to run towards Klemper. He got 3 steps before his legs refused to obey him any further. He stood there, frozen in place, paralysed from the neck down. Klemper laughed. "You can't raise a hand against me unless I will it." He walked over to Reyes and didn't seem to be slightest bit bothered about the sword that the harpy was holding right above his head. "I don't want to have to think about you all the time I'm fighting a duel with your friend Mangloss, and I don't want any distractions. It's true I could just hold you in place with my willpower, but that too would be a distraction. So I'm going to cast something to hold you in place until I'm ready to deal with you." "Mangloss would tear you apart," Reyes said defiantly. "Really?" Klemper said, his voice calm. "You do realise that the only reason that he isn't doing anything right now is because I'm holding him the same way I'm holding you." "You wouldn't stand a chance without your will magic," Reyes accused. "Well," Klemper countered, "I guess we're about to find out, aren't we?" Then Klemper reached out and touched Reyes lightly on the forehead. Reyes could no longer feel the rest of his body. The best he could manage was to move his eyes left or right, and when he did so, the sight that befell them came as something of a shock. His arms, visible because he was holding a sword above his head, had turned a lighter shade of grey. They were no longer the harpy grey that Reyes was used to, but they were of a more stony grey, and seemed to be just as malleable. When he peered down at his muzzle, Reyes could see that too had changed to the same shade of grey. Reyes had a feeling that his entire body was now made out of stone, but somehow he was still alive and still aware of what was going on. He almost felt as if he could move his head just a little, but when he tried to speak he found that he couldn't even open his mouth. "What did you do to him?" Mangloss accused, asking the question that was on Reyes' mind. "Don't worry," Klemper said. "He's not dead. I'll change him back before I do kill him. I just don't want him getting in the way of our fun." "Fun?" Mangloss said sceptically. "Well, okay, my fun, your death," Klemper replied. "By the way, you can move again now. This duel would be no fun at all if I didn't let you move. I also promised to avoid the use of will magic during this duel. After all, it's not going to be any fun at all if it's too easy." Mangloss straightened himself up. He stared across the short distance between him and Klemper. Then he took a firm grip on his staff and held it at an angle of about 30 degrees to show that he was ready. Klemper grinned. "I almost expected you to try a sneak attack." He turned away from Mangloss and walked for about 20 paces towards the far end of the room. "I haven't heard of a duel being fought between mages for over 200 years. I guess it's only right that we should follow the traditional niceties." Klemper turned to face Mangloss. He angled his own staff to about 30 degrees and peered across the room at his opponent. Then, before Mangloss could move, a large white number appeared in the air between them. It began a countdown from 20. Although Reyes was looking at it from a different angle than both Mangloss and Klemper, the number seemed as if it was intended for him. Such was the nature of magic. "When the counter reaches 0, we shall begin," Klemper instructed. "Fair enough," Mangloss agreed. The two stood stoically still, neither of them even so much as flinching, neither wanting to give the other any sign of anticipation or weakness. Reyes watched as the magical counter ticked away the seconds. Even when the counter reached the last few seconds, neither of the two mages had moved a single muscle. They just stood there, staring at each other through the counter, waiting patiently for the last second. When the counter finally reached 0 and then vanished from sight, Mangloss began to move. He moved quickly, lifting up his staff and beginning his first spell. Klemper just stood there, waiting. He held the same pose as if he was still waiting for the counter to count down. Mangloss threw his spell. It was a spit of fire, a very underpowered spell intended more to test his opponent's defences rather than anything more serious. Even if all Klemper did was stand there and take it, the spell would do little more than singe his clothing. Klemper didn't move. He seemed to cast no kind of counter-spell, yet that spit of fire struck a magical cocoon that surrounded him. The cocoon flared blue for a moment as the spit of fire dissipated harmlessly. Mangloss tried another spell. A few of those green globules he had thrown at the enemy soldiers. The globules flew well-described arcs through the air, and again struck Klemper's magical cocoon. "I would try something else," Klemper suggested, actually sounding a little wistful. Then Klemper struck back. He moved just one hand and from it burst a heavy blue flame. It streaked across the short distance between the two mages and engulfed Mangloss. Mangloss braced himself. He stretched forward a little and met the flame with his hands outstretched. Somehow he was able to redirect the flame around him rather than through him. When Klemper finally released the spell, Mangloss was visibly quite tired but untouched by the flame. "Try this," Klemper commented. Klemper then clicked his fingers, and a dozen or more daggers, each one identical to his brother's, went spinning through the air towards Mangloss. The daggers glowed with a blue magical light for a moment, but it vanished moments later. They were real daggers, not just energy representations of daggers. Reyes could hardly believe his eyes. He had always thought that such magic was virtually impossible. Klemper would have had to have summoned them from somewhere, but so many, and all of them already in motion. Reyes began to wonder if maybe his old friend and mentor truly was outclassed this time. Mangloss threw himself to the ground. The daggers passed harmlessly over his prone body and struck the wall behind him. Mangloss then jumped to a squatting position and almost immediately reached out and touched the floor in front of him. The room began to shake quite violently, and Klemper was thrown off his feet as effectively as if Mangloss had pulled a rug out from under him. "That's more like it, old man," Klemper commented. "Using direct spells. Let's make a fight of it." Mangloss then gestured to one of the columns that supported the left side of the room. The pillar shook for a moment and then broke loose from its hold on the ceiling. Mangloss quickly turned his attention on the bottom of that same column, forcing it to topple over onto the fallen figure of Klemper. Klemper made no noise as the column fell. Reyes couldn't help but notice that the column Mangloss had selected was an analogue for the one that had been toppled over in the other version of this room. The room echoed with the sound of a crash. The column cracked and a few chunks fell off, but primarily it remained in one piece. Mangloss watched the fallen column for a moment as if he expected Klemper to reappear any second. Then he straightened himself up and made his way over to where Reyes was standing. He brushed the dust off his hands and said, "Now, how am I going to change you back? How am I going to get us home?" Klemper wasn't finished. There was movement over on the far side of the room, and the man who had once been advisor to the old King of Floth glided regally between the still standing columns, as if he owned the place. His robes seemed to shimmer slightly, as if they were catching the sun at just the right angle, and yet they were underground. A waste of magic if ever Reyes had seen one. "What?" Klemper said. "Did you really think we were done?" "I thought it was too easy," Mangloss said, turning round suddenly. Klemper replied, "Do you really think you can get the better of me? I've had almost 2 complete lifetimes to perfect the art of magic. While you have to take time to cast any spell, I can cast that same spell with but a thought. I've merely been playing with you until now." "Really?" Mangloss called back. "Then why don't you finish me if you're so powerful?" "It will be my pleasure," Klemper replied. He gesticulated towards the fallen column, lifting the whole thing up with his magic. Then he threw it wholesale towards the old mage. "Is that it?" Mangloss replied. Mangloss intercepted the column with his own magic and grabbed hold of the pillar. Then he shattered it into little more than dust. "No," Klemper said, pointing at Mangloss with his left hand. "That was just to keep you occupied." A heavy steel cage suddenly formed around Mangloss. He was trapped behind a mass of bars. The bars, like the daggers, glowing with a thin blue light, but unlike the daggers, that light stayed even after the cage had been formed. There was no door of any kind to the cage. There was no lock for the archmage to open. There was no immediately visible way out. Mangloss wasn't about to be cowed. He interlocked his thumbs and tried to cast a spell. The spell dissipated the moment it hit the bars of the cage. "What the?" Mangloss exclaimed rather loudly. "Call this a fair fight?" "It's a legitimate spell," Klemper replied, walking slowly towards the cage. "They use it in the Elven Empire to nullify the abilities of mages. Although I must admit they don't usually go to the effort of summoning the bars." "This is unfair," Mangloss insisted. He grabbed a couple of the bars in his hands and stared at Klemper. "You are a coward." "Now we see the true Mangloss," Klemper commented, calm and almost masterful when he thinks he's in control. But as soon as he feels vulnerable, he calls foul. "Well, perhaps I'm through fighting fair. It's time this duel came to an end." Mangloss moved to the back of the cage, away from Klemper. His eyes remained defiant, but struck as he was, they seemed devoid of any hope. Klemper rested a hand gently against one of the bars. The blue light faded and vanished. Seeing his chance, Mangloss immediately began to weave another spell. The old mage wasn't going to be fast enough. Klemper reached in through the bars of the cage with his staff and did nothing more than touch Mangloss lightly on the arm. Suddenly, the young and vital Mangloss who had been fighting the duel was an old man again. His face seemed to have developed a lot more wrinkles than Reyes ever remembered him having. His hair was of a brighter white, and he had a heavily receding hairline, revealing a forehead covered in liver spots. As old as Mangloss was, Reyes could never remember a time when the old mage had had any liver spots. Mangloss lost control of his spell. He staggered back against the cage, finding it hard to stay on his feet. "Counterspell," Klemper said. "It's such a useful little tool, and it's quite legal." Mangloss's voice sounded very croaky as he commented, "I am certainly no match for you now." "You never really were, old man," Klemper replied. Then he bent down and touched Mangloss on the forehead. Mangloss began to turn a shade of grey as his body slowly became stone. Not just the mage, but the clothing he wore, his robes, even his staff seemed to be affected by the spell. Mangloss struggled as best he could to fight the encroaching petrification of his body, but soon it had taken over every aspect of his being. Mangloss then straightened himself up and glanced over at Reyes. "Your mage friend is now dead." Then he paused for a moment. "But let's just make sure." Klemper then thrust the iron shoe of his mage's staff into the chest of the Mangloss statue. The statue buckled and began to crumble under the blow. Then the whole statue suddenly collapsed in on itself. If Reyes had had a voice, he would likely have cried out at that moment, but all he could do was watch as one of the people who he loved and trusted the most was turned into nothing more than a small pile of rock dust. Klemper turned from the cage and approached Reyes. "I promised you I would change you back before I killed you, but I can't help thinking it'd be far easier to deal with you as you are." Reyes didn't reply. He couldn't. "Nothing to say?" Klemper asked. He was clearly proud of himself for asking such an asinine question. Reyes looked around the room. Maybe Mangloss wasn't dead. After all, he had dropped an entire column on Klemper, and Klemper had survived to gloat about it. Maybe Mangloss wasn't really dead either. Maybe he had created an illusion of himself in the cage, and it was that who Klemper had killed. Maybe Mangloss would reveal himself again in a minute and strike Klemper down. Reyes knew it wasn't very likely, but he knew that even when all hope seemed lost, there were always possibilities. Klemper sighed. "Oh, well, a promise is a promise." He reached out and touched Reyes lightly on the forehead. Slowly, Reyes could feel the strength in his body returning. He could feel the weight of the sword he was still holding, ready to strike. Reyes waited for the very last bit of his body to revert to normal. He waited until he was sure Klemper was close enough, and then he tried to lash out with his sword. Nothing. He couldn't move. "I said I'd change you back," Klemper remarked. "I said nothing about letting you move. I still hold you in place for the power of my will." "You said no will magic," Reyes reminded. "That was for the duel," Klemper replied. "That only applied to Mangloss." "I challenge you to a duel," Reyes provoked. "I just defeated your master, a man whose magical prowess is likely to be 1,000 times more powerful than yours." "No, I don't think so. I think it would be a waste of time. My time, anyway. You don't have any left." "You are a coward," Reyes accused. "Well, it had worked for Mangloss." "You know," Klemper said, "that really is a weak insult. By now my minions would have dealt with your other friends. Your sister will be my prisoner, and tonight I'll hand her over to my master, for whatever reason he wants her. That just leaves you. It's time you were leaving us." And with that comment, a dagger suddenly materialised in Klemper's right hand. He lifted the dagger to Reyes' throat and seemed to say with the fear that Reyes was feeling, "Don't worry, I'll make it quick."